I now have a few questions that I'd like to put to the group as a whole. Joe, starting with you, in your view, are there ways for facts and fact checks to be presented in a nonpartisan way, in a way that reduces finger pointing and resistance, and ideally that increases understanding and acceptance?
Yeah, I think if you look at the current situation, I think the major problem is that sometimes the fact check doesn't catch up to the misstatement. And I look at, particularly with the president, but also with Governor Cuomo and the others who are on live TV. Live TV to me is a bargain between the broadcaster and the politician, that both sides will do their best to tell the truth and accurately put it forward. The president will tell the truth. The news network will not uh, play with the audio or play with the video to make the president look better or worse. Um, and we're in a current situation now where the president's not holding up his end of the bargain, because he has told so many falsehoods, so many lies. So I think we have to re-examine how we put him on. And I don't think that's a partisan issue. I think if a Democrat breaks that bargain, that implicit bargain, they should be treated the same way. So I think, and I'm interested in those who have studied this as opposed to me who just thinks about it. If we put the president on a delay so that we could stop in real time and say, well, that's not true, or that's misleading, what impact that might have. And if nothing else, it would be a really powerful incentive for a political leader, either on the left or on the right, to tell the truth, because no one likes to be interrupted and told that their nose is growing. As of now, I think too much of the advantage is on the side of the politician, putting the media at a disadvantage.
Angie, what's Politifact's strategy for this? Do you try to minimize the partisan feel of fact checks? And if so, how do you go about that?
We are nonpartisan, and we're always looking for ways to appeal to people of different political points of view, different political parties. But there's a balance, because we can't shade the truth. We can't do a false on a Republican and then say, oh, we're going to go out and find a false on a Democrat. And I think some members of the public think that a balanced media would look like that. But in the real world, we find that it really depends on the statement and if it's true or not. There is a tension, I think, between fact checking and what some people would call civility. Sometimes political truths are very divisive, and they don't necessarily bring people together. But speaking as a journalist and a practicing journalist, our first ethical commitment is to the truth and to telling people what the world is, not what they would like it to be. But it is a tension that we grapple with in all of our coverage.
Ethan, what does the research tell us about this?
So just two big thoughts. The first being, on two separate occasions, I've worked to actually fact check Donald Trump in real time, during the first presidential debate with Hillary Clinton and a State of the Union address he gave while he was president. And in these studies, we actually were giving people fact checks that people like Angie were providing. We were giving to people at random and seeing if indeed the fact checks could work immediately, right? On the day that Trump, literally within an hour of Trump actually misspeaking. And what we found was I think generally in line with what we all would want to find, which was that across the ideological and partisan spectrum, even within the day of the president making a misstatement, people respond to fact checks by becoming more factually accurate, right? Now that's really interesting, and that suggests that Joe's idea of fact checking in real time and maybe pausing or interrupting in some way, or certainly running something alongside the bottom of the screen, I think has real merit. And I've always been pleasantly surprised when I see TV networks doing that kind of thing, because I think it works, and I think the evidence supports the idea that it works.
Next, I'd like to consider political versus public interests. Joe, what are some of the things the White House might be weighing as it considers how to balance, on the one hand, communication strategies that most benefit the president politically, versus, on the other hand, those strategies that might most benefit the public, but aren't necessarily aligned with political considerations?
Well, you've really hit on the inherent conflict in the job. If you look from the press secretary's point of view, most press secretaries look at their job as a way to help advance the president's agenda and keep the public informed as you go. But when you get into a crisis, I think that balance changes. I think it changes more towards what the public interest is, because a political agenda and political narratives are really kind of, by definition, short term. You're trying to get an advantage over the other party to get something concrete done. But when you get into an open-ended crisis like this, that where we don't know when it's going to end, I think you have to kind of put the political agenda to the side and really just look at the public's interest, what they need to know about how to act, what to worry about, what not to worry about, and let the politics take care of themselves. My old boss, President Clinton, had a phrase when we'd get into this fight he'd say to us that good policy always makes good politics. Good politics doesn't always make good policy. So I think that really gets at, in a time of crisis, that you need to submerge your political agenda despite your instincts for promoting it, and just let the facts play out and demonstrate your ability to get your job done. To put it more simply, you want to show and not tell. You can tell later.
Ethan, how effective do you think the White House has been in communicating from each of these perspectives? That is, based on the administration's political interest versus the broader public interest.
I think usually when we think about presidential communications, we think that the bully pulpit is limited in power and is probably at its highest point right after the inauguration, and then the president's ability to sway public opinion declines over the duration of an administration. Indeed, I have a paper that I'm happy to discuss making that exact point. This is different though, because people are all sitting at home watching TV, right? They can sit there, watch TV, consume the news, and suddenly people are captive. There's a captive audience in a way that is pretty unusual. What this means for the public and for Trump's political incentives may be misaligned, right? Which is another way of saying that Donald Trump's political outlook might do better in the short term if he spreads misinformation. He appears to have made that calculus. We have some evidence in the book False Alarm that indeed politicians can benefit from spreading misinformation, and indeed Trump himself benefits when he spreads misinformation. However, we also have evidence, and this is sort of the flip side of all this, that Trump is harmed when he is subjected to factual corrections and factual interventions, right? His approval rating will go up a little bit if he makes a lot of misstatements, but it will go down by about the same amount if people read fact checks of those misstatements, right? So Trump might see some small gain in spreading misinformation, but it's more incumbent than ever on fact checkers, journalists, and everyday people to sort of share and communicate factual information, because factual information is actually still really important and people are still really responsive to it. And I think sometimes the White House loses sight of that, is my read just as an observer. People are able to sort of, if Trump says something about, drinking bleach or, ingesting hydroxychloroquine, there's this thing called Google now. People can go and search for their own and find their own information, and it tends to be pretty impactful. So, I think we should keep in mind that people seem pretty capable of discerning fact from fiction. And I think the White House has probably underestimated the extent to which they can.
Angie, what's your take on this from a journalistic perspective?
It's a really unusual time. I think the things we've seen with the daily press briefings being aired without any kind of interruption, that applies really to only 3 major news organizations, I would say: CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. And it's kind of having an outsized impact on the rest of the media. The rest of the media, especially the newspapers and the print media that have now become online news organizations, have been doing a really good job putting out a lot of informative information about testing, about the science, about what's happening in the States, about the economy. So it's kind of this mixed bag right now. And then people can go on social media and there's all kinds of misinformation. So you have a lot of high quality media contrasted with a lot of low quality media. Then we have the presidency and its bully pulpit, where the president has such an outsized voice in the political sphere. But now we're also seeing these governors come in. And what's really interesting to me is the governors are bipartisan. So you do have a Democrat like Andrew Cuomo in New York, but you also have Mike DeWine in Ohio and Larry Hogan in Maryland. So you've got these bipartisan governors who are being much more responsible with their factual accuracy. And it's creating this really interesting contrast for people at home. I know sometimes when I watch the media, I feel like my head is spinning. So there's a lot of highs and lows right now.
Finally, I'd like to ask each of you to reflect on what you think the current administration is getting right and what it's getting wrong in its communication strategy. Ethan, what's your assessment?
So if I have to give them credit for one thing, the administration seems at least to acknowledge the public's appetite for scientific expertise. That appetite, unfortunately, is not inexhaustible. Science is increasingly polarized. But at this point, public attitudes about the coronavirus are not nearly as polarized as attitudes about, say, climate change. And I think in part that's due to the administration's, I think sometimes reluctant willingness to feature Tony Fauci, right? To privilege medical and scientific credentials. I think sometimes that has been, they've been reluctant to do it, but they have done it. I think what's been a travesty has been their refusal to take the responsibility of truth seriously. People pay attention to the White House on any given day. They're paying a lot of attention to the White House now. And it would seem from a moral and ethical perspective that the White House should be invested in proliferating information that is factually accurate and scientifically sound. When the president issues recommendations about what to do, those recommendations should be grounded in science. Not just because that's what we want, but because there's a whole body of literature that says people respond to elite cues, right? People respond, especially if they're members of the same party, to what their political leaders do, often by mimicking or repeating that behavior and sharing those attitudes. It would be especially unfortunate if people did that when Trump issues unscientific, frankly, terrible advice. On the other hand, as I've emphasized throughout this conversation, I do have confidence in people's abilities to separate fact from fiction on their own.
Angie, what's your take on this? What is the White House getting wrong? What's it getting right?
I think the real low point so far has been President Trump's garbled suggestion that disinfectants inside the body would be helpful. I think that freaked out a lot of public health officials and a lot of the companies that make disinfectants because it's so obviously dangerous. But generally speaking, when I look at President Trump's messaging over this crisis, it seems like President Trump just being himself. He hasn't changed. He's always been like this. He likes to speak off the cuff. He likes to say things that are provocative. So this is really President Trump being President Trump. For the positive side, I think that putting forward the medical and scientific experts has been very strong. Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, I think, have by far been the best spokespersons for the administration. And the Centers for Disease Control has a really wonderful website. It's well organized, it's clear for everyday people to go on and find credible, authoritative information about the virus and how to prevent its spread.
Joe, are there moments in particular from the Clinton administration that parallel the pressures faced by the current administration? Were there mistakes made or lessons learned that could inform today or even future presidential administrations?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I don't think there's anything that compares to what's going on now. There's a lot of different, what they called scenario planning and tabletop exercises. And I participated in one that had to do with a nuclear dirty bomb coming to the United States on a plane, and everyone in the National Security Council sat around the table. And that was fascinating to me and embarrassing to me, because I made two decisions at the beginning of it that put me out of the loop for the entire thing, and so there was no mechanism for communicating to the public because of those decisions. So I don't think there's anything that compares. I mean, obviously, the impeachment of the President Clinton gripped the country, but it didn't make people stay in their house. They were still allowed to go out to dinner, go to a movie if they wanted to. This is something that's unusual. Going to the original question, I think I've talked a little bit about what I think they've done wrong. They've not told the truth. They've undermined the credibility, and they've, as much as the scientists are important, they've pushed them back to the side. And in particular, President Trump has pushed them into the background way too often. Here's what I think they've done right. They've gone everywhere. I'll give two examples of Dr. Fauci that I think were extremely important for getting the message out. He did an interview with Barstool Sports, which if you're a young man of 18 to 30, that's one of your go-to places to get information. It's not CNN, it's not MSNBC. He also did an interview with Steph Curry, the basketball player for the Golden State Warriors. It's that sort of thing that gets the message out to everyone where they live, as opposed to thinking that everybody's tuning in to CNN. I think Dr. Birx has also done some of these things. You know, she's been on all the Fox programs, but also on MSNBC. So they've tried to reach across the partisan divide. Unfortunately, I think they've been undermined by the president continually coming back and making this partisan.
Thank you so much to everyone for joining our discussion today. It's been incredibly interesting, incredibly enlightening. Please, everyone, be well and stay safe. I'm Rebecca Tromble from the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at George Washington University.